We're live. We are live, and I will get myself back today out of last week. Looking at the testimony on that. To start, today is February 12th. It's my grandson's birthday. Oh. And I have to remember to call me. And we're going to do a walkthrough of S-161. This is an act relating to the governor's list of scholarship granting organizations. And we have Senator Bonegard, who's the chief sponsor, who's just going to tell us why or what. And that we have Kirby, who's going to walk us through it. This is just our initial walkthrough, and I think this may be our last bill to walk through. What
about the ones we're going to here?
Oh, but those will, when we get them, we'll walk through them. I think
The ones that are here now.
yeah. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, the federal budget act passed, which is a bill that I think is a full piece of legislation for what it's worth. And had a provision in it, which is also there for various purposes. But within that, after reading about it, I began to collaborate and talk to the ledger council, first with John and then Kirby, about whether there's a way to make something positive out of it. So what it is, what this bill tries to do is take a provision that allows for the creation of nonprofit organizations whose purpose is to give scholarships. The way it's intended in the federal bill, it's to give scholarships. Frankly, I think the underlying intent has to do with using tax dollars to fund private schools, kids going to private schools, the vouchers in the voucher system, which we don't have. But anyway, putting all that aside, the question was, so as I talked to the ledge council about it, they said, if the bill is out to here, you're allowed, you can narrow it. And so I began to think about whether we could take a lemon and turn it into lemonade. And so we tailored the bill very narrowly to say that the scholarship granting organization approved by the governor has to be for the purpose of providing opportunity to low-income kids for after-school programs, summer programs, or tutoring or similar programs. So try to make sure that the organization has the mission of serving underprivileged kids, number one, and then number two, limit it to something. People talked about other things. As somebody who has raised a lot of money in my career, I know that the narrower the purpose and the more you can explain it in one sentence, the more likely it is that people will give to it. And so I kept it very narrow to after school, summer tutoring. Something that people will intuitively understand, especially as it relates to underprivileged children. And so the way that it works is that anybody who pays federal income taxes of $1,700 or more actually can, well, anyway, just leave it at that. You really have a choice. This is a tax credit as opposed to a deduction, which means you get it back. And so the idea is that anybody who pays $1,700 or more in federal income taxes has a choice of giving it to the federal government or giving it to a qualified organization for the purpose of helping underprivileged children, one of those three categories. And then you get it back because it's a tax credit. So it's actually that simple. And it's something that I think the estimate is, by the way, that I've forgotten how many billions of dollars that the federal government estimates is going to happen with this program, mostly in states for other purposes, but we're going to be paying for that. because it's a federal tax credit. And so the question is, can we take effectively what would be our share and do something good with it? And so that's the purpose of the bill. I see it could be, I haven't talked to them, but this is the kind of thing that maybe Vermont Community Foundation could hang an organization underneath and run, be the place for people to get to this program. So it has to, incidentally, it has, I think it's in here, but it has to, the governor has to qualify the organization as meeting the intent as articulated in the bill.
I never thought about the bus to Lotus Lake has gone through Montpelier every summer. And we've had fresh air kids from Boston come out and spend time with my family in Massachusetts. But I don't know off the top of my head about a scholarship for lower income kids. It costs several $100s a week to go to the day camp at the rec department has. That's a lot of money.
I'll just tell a story. I was getting ready to run for the Senate. I spent some time with Sue McGuire, who's a former principal of the Poly Star, where she started community schools in Vermont. And she said to me, one way to think about education and the challenges is to provide true middle-class opportunity for underprivileged kids. Our kids, I know the opportunity that my son had, like with camps and otherwise, and I want those to be available for them. This is a mechanism talking about helping underprivileged kids achieve some of those same middle-class opportunities.
You said, Meadows, did you have
I did, yeah.
and then Senator Hardy? I'm looking to see if I missed anything.
So our local community center offers our after school program. Would that, and it's a nonprofit, would that kind of settle into here? I just looked up 26 US.
So you have to have, and Kirby can do this more specifically, but the organization has to be for the purpose of granting scholarships.
Oh, okay. So it's not the
So
organization
it has
that
to be
provides that.
separate organization.
Got it. Got it.
Okay, but you could get a scholarship to go
Yes, you
to
can get
that.
scholarships.
Got it.
Yeah.
Did you make changes in the Senate Education Committee to the bill after it was introduced? Because what the bill that's posted on our website is as introduced and it doesn't
Oh,
track the way you just
What's that?
described it.
Did you amend it in?
no, I don't think so.
You didn't amend
No.
It doesn't, what you just described doesn't sound like what the bill says, but maybe I'll just wait
Okay,
for.
well, we'll talk.
Kirby's.
Kirby's gonna walk us through it.
Okay.
There was that technical change.
What was that?
There was that technical change.
Right, a little tiny thing, yes.
Okay, well,
But, it was. What I said is right. So what I was talking about is at the top of page 2. Nonprofit organization with core mission of providing educational opportunities to economically underprivileged students through after-school programs. And the technical changes, we have left out the word summer from the programs. We added that in, tutoring and similar programs. So that was the only change, right?
I'll show you what they voted on.
okay.
Okay, have we
All
got
right.
any questions for Senator Bogart? Then we can have Kirby walk us through it. And then we can see if we'd like to hear from anyone else. There was a lot of interest when we were doing out the money for the prevention money from cannabis and that to go to schools or other programs. Yeah,
You talked
so
about
I'm assuming there will be interest in this.
that. So incidentally, I forgot to tell you, we heard from Rick Keaton, and we heard from Emily Simonson.
That's it? You just heard two witnesses?
Yes.
Interesting.
Thank you. I'll let you go back and
Okay. Thanks.
Kirby, maybe you can walk us through this.
That's most staff.
Okay, good afternoon. Kirby Eaton. Office of Legislative Council.
We're not talking about education funding yet.
No, we're not. You're seeing my face instead of John or Beth or someone, because what we're really talking about is federal tax credit. Talking about income tax at the end of the day. So I thought I would share with you first the federal law and get a knowledge of that before proceeding on to what's being proposed for changes for Vermont law. And I was in Ways and Means yesterday doing the same thing because there's a House proposal that is not a companion, quite different.
The opposite.
Oh, okay. I see a committee of conference showing up at that point.
So let's walk through. As Senator Wongard mentioned, the gist of this is there's a new federal income tax credit that was created by HR 1. That's a credit of up to $1,700 at the federal level. So as we talk through this, to be very clear, any talk of credits is this federal income tax credit. There's not a proposal for a state income tax credit. You're not talking about a state credit. What we are mostly talking about is the state's ability under this federal law to identify scholarship granting organizations within Vermont that taxpayers would be allowed to contribute to and claim federal credit. So Vermont's role here would be to identify the scholarship granting organizations themselves. Within that, Vermont could, through state law, put other restrictions on what kinds of organizations can be identified for purposes of this list that's given to the U.S. Treasury Secretary for purposes of this tax credit program.
So this does not affect the revenues of the state,
This does not affect revenues in the state.
just federal. But we can narrow down the list of organizations, like what it could. Is that what I heard?
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct. The role here would be for the state to decide what kind of organizations, if any, the state would like to recognize for participation in this. Another, before we get, since we're talking about, the 10,000 foot view, I'll also say that, we'll probably cover this later, but the way this is structured, my reading of the federal law is that a Vermont resident can contribute to an SGO that's been recognized in a different state and still claim this credit. So the conversation is not specifically about, do we let Vermonters participate in this program? It's more like, do we let student or scholarship granting organizations become creative and exist in Vermont for this program? Okay. All right, so we'll get into all the pieces of it. We've talked about the allowance of the credit at the federal level. We've talked about the credit amount being $1,700. We've talked about the covered state, which means a state that has decided to send a list under its own laws. That's the conversation we're having now. Is Vermont going to be a covered state? And what does that look like for Vermont? So the first part to understand at the federal level is getting into eligible students. This has to do with when we get into it later about scholarship granting organizations and all of the federal requirements here for those. A certain percentage of the scholarships have to be to eligible students. That's defined as a member of a household with an income which for the calendar year prior to the date of application for a scholarship is not greater than 300% of the area median gross income. Yesterday in Ways and Means, I threw out a ballpark figure for that. This time I'm going to say you can ask JFO for numbers, and then we're not. Because the committee was like, that was numbers that sound right, and I'm like, I give up. That's not me. So you could also, of course, these are publicly available numbers. You can Google, what the area median gross income for Vermont is. It's county based. And the eligible student has to be eligible to enroll in a public elementary or secondary school. So those are the requirements under the federal law for an eligible student. The
They don't have to
qualified,
be enrolled, they just have to be eligible to be enrolled.
yes.
Okay.
The qualified contribution, so you receive, the taxpayer could receive tax credit for qualified contributions. That means a charitable contribution of cash, so no donating property, of cash to a
No
scholarship.
deer meat, huh?
Um,
Last year.
No deer meat.
It was the deer
Yes.
meat, right?
Dear me, you can't give up your old car if you want to take a credit.
Okay, cash only.
Cash only
Better
to
bill on
to a scholarship granting organization that uses the contribution to fund scholarships for eligible students solely within the state in which the organization is listed.
that.
Does the organization have to give the scholar? Can it be an organization that gives scholarships to students who attend someplace else? Or, does it have to be the entity provides the educational service and also the scholarship? Like the school,
Not that part. The organization, we'll get into it, they have to be a 501c3 organization, and it grants scholarships, and it has all these requirements to follow. For a contribution to count, it has to be a cash contribution to fund scholarships to eligible students solely within. So if we're talking about a hypothetical Vermont SGO, those scholarships given out have to be to Vermont students only.
do they have to be the Vermont entities only? Like if somebody.
I know, yeah, I understand your question. The federal law focuses on the scholarships to the student, not where they're enrolled or where they're spending it.
Okay, so if you live on the border, you could go to a day camp in Massachusetts or New York.
Yeah, I'm not remembering a provision that would preclude that, but
Okay.
we'll get into all the
I
requirements
think
later.
we're assuming most of them would be in Vermont.
And just to be clear, this is not primarily for camps. This is not about
Oh,
day
no.
camps and
It
summer
is-
camps.
It is,
About,
well, it's camps, tutoring, after-school programs.
it's vouchers to private schools, Madam Chair.
We'll get into what are allowable
Okay,
expenses,
let's do that.
in a
That
bit.
isn't how I understood.
And to jump ahead a little bit, part of this program is ambiguous this time because there's a mandate for the IRS to issue regulations, filling in some of the gaps that aren't here. And what's an allowable expense is part of that open question that we expect that the IRS will address more fully. So at the moment, I'm not in a position to tell you what every allowable expense is. I think there's clarity that's on the way, but it's not out yet.
But we're saying that it is our intent that I suppose it could go to an after-school program at a private school. Or it could go to an after-school program at a public school.
S 161 addresses that. And then the open question is, once the IRS regulations come out, will those two be aligned? And we don't fully know. There's some, anticipation of what the IRS is going to say through regulation.
If they are too onerous, can we unparticipate ourselves? Can we say no? I mean, if we pass this and then they come out and
Mhm.
we find that they're onerous, if it's possible, we could say we changed our mind and
Yes, you could amend if you pass the law of the session relating to this, it can be amended like anything else.
Okay,
The participation through the federal program is a year-to-year participation. So the state could go in and out of that. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about the contributions. Now, the definition for qualified elementary or secondary education expenses. There's this Cloverdale, accounts, program that exists under federal law that's referenced.
okay,
in a
this is the
nutshell.
federal law. This is not what's being proposed.
This is not what's being proposed. I'm just explaining the ins and outs of the credit for you,
Okay,
so you understand the context of what you're deciding for the state part of it. So these expenses include tuition, things like uniforms, things like certain, technology to, that's education related. There is reference to tutoring. Whether that extends fully to every type of after school program or summer program, that's kind of an unknown right now. There could be a broad interpretation under the IRS regulations that does include all of that would allow scholarships for all of the sorts of things, but we don't know.
maybe STEM camp? Or
Maybe.
robotics camp?
Yeah, maybe. So that's where I'm aware that the IRS has asked for input for its regulations so far. And I'm aware that there's been lobbying input at federal level to have those regulations cover all those things you're talking about. But we don't actually
don't
know. And there's not even a proposed regulation at this point. Okay, so scholarship granting organization, a lot of the requirements for participation is about what can an SGO do? What does an SGO have to do? So an SGO is an organization which, one, is a 501c3 and is not a private foundation. So that's the first rule at the outset. Second, an SGO has to prevent the commingling of qualified contributions with other amounts by maintaining one or more separate accounts exclusively for qualified contributions. Third, it has to follow a list of requirements that we're going to get to in a second. And fourth, it has to be included on the list submitted by the covered state for under subsection G. That's what we're talking about right now. An SGO does not exist if Vermont chooses to not participate, chooses not to send a list. So it would never qualify under that provision. So what are some of the other federal requirements? The organization meets the requirements of this subsection if, first, the organization provides scholarships to 10 or more students who do not all attend the same school. Second, the organization spends not less than 90% of the income of the organization on scholarships for eligible students. This is, I mentioned before, when we looked at the eligible student definition, it is 90% of the income on these scholarships. So there's some leeway for the SGO to use some of this income for other things,
Like,
possibly administrative costs.
and that's what I'm wondering is we're gonna set up an NCO, they're gonna do this. But if there's no administrative cost. Yeah, that will cost somebody, if there's nothing to be taken out, all right?
Third, the organization does not provide scholarships for any expenses other than the qualified elementary or secondary education expenses. Again, that's why it's important for us to learn what the IRS is going to consider for that.
So what does that link go to? The qualified elementary or secondary?
That's supposed to go to the Cloverdale, but I've tried this before and it goes nowhere.
It goes nowhere. Okay.
But I can pull that out if you want.
Well, I mean, the way that sounds is it's just for schools. It's not for after schools and summer camps and things like that. It's for education, elementary education and secondary education. It's for like going to private school.
Do you want me to pull up those expenses, the federal that should be linked there?
Well, I think
It's
the question is-
it's going to be 26 USC 530 sub B3A.
And I think the question is, we are saying that if Vermont is going to participate, this is what our participation will look like if they come back whenever and say, no, it has to go to tuition to eligible private schools, then we can say no.
But that's what this bill that we're looking at says. Madam
Yes,
Chair.
well, that's what we're working on, but what the bill in front of us says is that this is where we want to send it. If they say no, then.
But the bill in front of us says that private elementary school and high
That's
school
what
are,
federal,
no, that's what this bill says, Madam Chair.
that's
61.
Yes.
61, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
161, yeah.
Let's walk through
So
this one and then we'll let Kirby tell us
so
what
the
he's got.
so the reference under the federal law brings you here. This is the, I don't know if I've been saying this right every time I say it. Coverdale Education Savings Account. So I'm gonna, I call it Clover at some point.
You did say Clover.
It doesn't, Cloverdale sounds nice. But so at any rate, we have these expenses. So these savings accounts that exist under federal law allow expenses for tuition, fees, academic tutorings. There you go. Special needs services in the case of special needs beneficiary, book supplies, other equipment. Also expenses for room and board, uniforms, transportation, and supplementary items and services, including extended day programs. So that is some indication that you should expect some after school. And expenses for the purchases of any computer technology or equipment or internet access and related services.
It says which are provided by a public, private, or religious school.
Yes. It,
That's federal. Yes. I think we know what the feds were trying to do with this.
Yes, it's the fix.
The question is, can we remold it into something that might help
Mhm.
some Vermont students?
But we can't not follow the federal, if we opt in, we can't not follow the federal laws and regulations for the program.
You can't contradict the requirements, as in you can't say, well, we're gonna allow these extra expenses. That's not allowed. You can't do something like that. But what you could do is say, we are not going to list any SGO that, I feel like any example I use right now is gonna
Yeah.
be like a policy
careful, be
advocacy,
careful.
right? So, but you could limit it further to say that for some of the things that could be allowable at the federal level for an SGO to do, we would not for Vermont SGOs recognize.
Mhm.
And the way this credit was written is it was written seemingly to intentionally give that open room for states to have this conversation. I think might be
And
part of the reason.
I just got a note that we are 15 minutes behind and the room is full of witnesses. So I think this is just our initial walkthrough.
Okay.
Let's let Kirby walk us through this as quickly as possible. And then when we take it up, we will have time to delve into word by word dissection. Get one of those, not dissecting a sentence.
Yes, I do. Fun, good times.
We will do that.
So I'm going to show you the Senate Education Amendment, so that you'll see the language that they voted on. So S 161 here. It puts into the executive title, a section on the governor's list of scholarship granting organizations. It gives the governor or designee the ability to provide a list of organizations that satisfy the conditions of this section and also, or of this section to the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury for purposes of making the federal qualified elementary and secondary education scholarship tax credit available for Vermont taxpayers. There's a provision saying it shall be presumed that an organization listed in the previous year will be listed in subsequent year unless the governor finds that the organization has failed to meet the requirements of the section. That provision is meant to give some stability so that an organization from year to year can tell its donors that, hey, look, we've been listed before. We expect to be listed in the future. So if you donate to us, the credit should be available for you. An organization shall not be listed, so this is where there's some narrowing down this language. An organization shall not be listed unless the organization meets the following criteria. One, it qualifies under federal law as a scholarship granting organization. Two, it is a nonprofit organized with the core mission of providing educational opportunities to economically underprivileged students through after-school programs, summer programs, tutoring, and similar programs. That is the provision that has some wordsmithing changes in Senate Committee, Senate Education Committee. To fulfill this, the organization would have, this has to do with the organization's core mission as in its articles of incorporation. The third requirement here is all grants and scholarships provided are to students attending a public school or an independent school that's capable of receiving public tuition. And those are the additional requirements that you have in this 161. Subsection C there is just a provision about the governor's ability to audit these organizations to make sure they comply with the federal and state requirements. And they would be effective July 1, 2026. The federal program becomes effective January 1, 2027. And so that would be people making contributions in 2027, but then on tax filings after that.
Okay, yeah. It'll be another year, all right. Okay. So that is our efforts to say, if we're gonna participate, we're going to narrow the federal allowable to a smaller subset
Mhm.
that we think might benefit a subset of our kids that don't have any kind of really organized financial support for these kinds of programs. And we'll have to see if what we want meets future federal guidelines, but we can get out. And, or we could probably put something in here that said, in the event that federal guidelines will not allow this narrowing, Vermont will not take part in the program.
Are we able to, we have time for questions? I have a quick one.
One or two, and then we've got a full room here.
And maybe you can answer these at a later date possibly. I'm curious what similar programs would be in the list of things that would be included as covered. Summer tutoring and similar programs. And then I'm finding the language capable of receiving public tuition to be really interesting. That's a interesting turn of phrase. What is capable of? Is that they are receiving public tuition or they? I just don't understand.
Under Vermont's education laws, if they're capable.
So, okay, currently in post Act 73.
That's a good question.
Okay.
I would want to consult with Beth about that.
I mean, all it's looking in the schools are.
I don't know. That's what I'm asking.
I think if they're already receiving it, clearly they're capable, but your question is theoretically capable. It's broader than maybe what people might expect.
Right.
Yeah.
And my question was a similar question, because I read some of the information about the federal schools. I think it says public, private, or religious. And religious schools, to the best of my knowledge in Vermont right now, are not capable of receiving funds. Is that the intent to keep to in effect, as you look at that language, does that put us in conflict with the federal law?
It doesn't put us in conflict, but it certainly does narrow down
Just how long
what's
after we
allowed
pass something like that will we be sued?
Hmm?
It's how long after we pass something like that will we be sued?
I read this as permissible under federal law, or I don't think there would be a conflict with federal law. No. It's certainly written in a way which there's opportunities for states to tailor this. If it weren't, then the federal law would be very clear that, if for a state were to participate, these must be followed. There's no framework for that.
So thank you. We will take this up again.
Can you send the link to that website that you were on? That,
Cover that.
or no, the Cornell website that they were going through. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna move us on to 220. Because we asked Julia to do a whole lot of data research for us. And we're going to get. Well, hey, welcome back. We've had several days without it.
I know, I missed you.
Good morning, good afternoon.
It is.
I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. We are pivoting to S-220, which is the spending cap bill that you've all been talking about over the last days. I'm joining the Zoom link. While I'm doing that, there are a number of spreadsheets and documents that have been posted on the committee page under my name. I heard the request for more data and more analysis, and so I thought I would share the weedy analysis that usually I aggregate up to a summary chart level today. So before walking through any of the spreadsheets, which Charlotte has printed.
Okay.
Wow, big ones.
Data dump.
That's what I heard the request from the committee.
This is it.
That's what.
You're getting.
It comes with aspirin.
What's that?
It comes with aspirin, doesn't it?
I did take one at lunch.
Thanks.
So before diving into these spreadsheets, I want to say high level sort of what is and isn't captured in them and a word of caution. The underlying data used for all of these spreadsheets come from the Agency of Education Unit. And it is publicly available on their website or on the school district redistricting task force website. So all of it has been downloaded online with the exception of some of the tuition. They only have PDFs. So I had to ask for the Excel version. So you can see all of the data on their website. That said, there are some places where it seems as though there is an error in the data coding in some of the tuition reports. It doesn't. So there are a few places if you're looking at the data and you think that something looks really off, it is probably an underlying data error. We'll talk about that. So would you like me to decide where to begin, or do you
I
have?
think, yeah, you.
Okay.
The one that knows where to start it.
Okay, so sort of the spreadsheets and handouts that you have in front of you today can be sort of lumped into two categories. One is looking at changes in tuition, and the other is looking at the underlying analysis of the allowable growth percentage. Let's start on the allowable growth percentage. That's you can see colors, it's the colored spreadsheet. So it's the
Big piece of paper.
big piece of paper, not that one.
Okay.
It's a big piece of paper underneath.
Okay.
I'll pull it up.
This one?
Yes, thank you. Nope, the one behind it.
This one?
Nope. Can I touch it?
You absolutely.
Thank you, Senator. This one,
Oh, the one with colors,
the one with color.
like you said, yeah.
Yeah.
Blue and green.
Okay.
So,
Alright, this
yeah,
one's two.
there's two of them. Because,
Different years.
nope, it's the same spreadsheet, but, there were too many columns to fit on one sheet of paper. And I wanted to show you all of the work, so I put it on two sheets of paper. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, which is not color coded, to walk you through the underlying work here. So we're looking at the two color coded blue spreadsheets.
Okay.
This is the same, what I'm sharing here is the spreadsheet
Education spending.
with the same numbers.
Okay.
Of the color coded pieces you have there. Really what, the reason that it's on two spreadsheets is you're looking at the same spreadsheet over multiple documents. So I'm just gonna walk through it. First, we're looking at the one that's titled, FY 25 and FY 26 raw data or data review of education spending, long-term weighted ADM. So those are our first columns. So what we're looking at here is by school, that I included counties as assigned by AOE. And then by school district, first we see their FY 25 education spending. You'll recall that education spending is calculated by taking the school district's total budget, subtracting its offsetting revenues, which are those state and federal categorical aid, tuition revenues received to the district's reserves. What's left over is education spending. We've got the FY 25 education spending, the FY 26 education spending of the same district, and then the relative change in education spending from FY 25 to FY 26 for every school district in the state. Next, so these first sets of columns are to level set in terms of what is the picture that we're looking at before we're talking about allowable growth. Next is the long-term weighted average daily membership. So the long-term weighted ADM. Recall this is essentially the weighted pupil count of each district. So again, we've got the FY 25 weighted pupil count, the FY 26 weighted pupil count, and then the relative change in the pupil count from FY 25 to 26 for each of those districts. So for instance, Addison Central, because it's the top line for everybody, and we've got Senator Hardy in the committee, we can see the education spending increased, had a relative increase of 3% from 25 to 26, and a relative change in weighted pupils by 10%. Next, we have the weighted per pupil spending. So recall this is done by taking the total education spending of the district, dividing it by its weighted pupil count, which gives us our per weighted pupil. This is the amount that is used for the local factor, the local adjustment on the homestead property tax rate. And I've calculated that. It's also available by AOE for FY 25 and 26. So in the case of Addison Central, because we're looking at the top row, we can see here that their per weighted pupil spending decreased by 6%. Relative change from 25 to 26. And intuitively, this makes sense, right? Because their education spending grew by 3%, but they saw a big influx of their weighted pupil count. So it makes sense that their per weighted pupil spending would decrease. So that is that first set of columns that we're looking at on that spreadsheet of the, of the data review. And now I've put the next set of columns on the next spreadsheet called the draft analysis for Senate Finance S220 draft 1.1. And this is how the allowable growth percentage would have been calculated if it were to have existed in FY 25 or FY 26. We know that wasn't the case. And this is a way of looking back that if it were to have existed, how would it have taken out, I mean, numbers percent, thank you, by district. So first we calculate the allowable growth percentage. And this is using that formula that we looked at the chart last week, and that's included in the language. And essentially it's that relationship with the highest, recall it's the difference between the district's per pupil spending in FY 25 and the highest per pupil spending in FY 25 multiplied by the statutory factor, which S220 has of 3%, 9%, and then a minimum floor allowable growth percentage of 3%. So What does that mean? It means that everybody gets at least 3% of allowable growth percentage. They could get higher if they are a lower spending district. Next, and please interrupt me if you have questions. I think that goes without saying. Next, I calculated what would the FY26 allowable per pupil spend have been if it were based off of the fiscal year 25 per pupil spending and allowable growth percentage calculation. So that's what we're seeing here in the next column, FY26 allowable per pupil spending. And that's simply done by taking the FY25 per pupil spending amount and multiplying it by 100 plus the allowable growth percentage. So in the case of Addison Central, it is that FY25 per weighted pupil spending multiplied by 103%, which gives us the FY26 allowable per pupil spending. I do want to make a note if anyone either watching or later decides to check any of these numbers with their calculator, they're not going to add up perfectly because of rounding. So you're looking at the rounded numbers. So a word of caution. So we just calculated the FY26 allowable per pupil spending. Next, we needed to John's point where he's saying if we're doing a dual test, we need apples to apples. So we need to look at what would the allowable total education spending be in FY26. And that is done by taking the allowable per pupil spending that we just calculated, that FY26 figure, and multiplying it by their weighted pupil count. How many weighted pupils do they have in FY26? What is the allowable per pupil spending for those students? And that gives us at the total level, the aggregate level, the FY26 ed spend at the allowable level. Now the committee has been contemplating the dual test. That's what I'm calling it here, where it's a district has a cap, whichever is higher, either that allowable ed spend that we just calculated, or their prior year ed spend increased by inflation, right? The NEPA. So that's what we see here. Here we see, okay, what is their FY25 education spending increased by inflation? 2.8%. That's what we see. So in the case of Addison Central, this is our top row, we see that, in fact, it is Addison Central would be able to spend more with the allowable growth percentage. So that is what would be permitted. That's what the cap would have been for Addison Central. Addison, oh, that's perfect. Addison Northwest would have received a higher cap if their FY25 ed spend were to be increased by NEPA. So they get the NEPA. It's the greater of.
And this is assuming that this law were in effect this year, but it's not. It will, so whatever budgets get voted this year, that will be the base.
That's a question that, if I can pick up on that.
Yes.
This is on FY26 last year. This is not on budgets warned for FY27 that people are voting on, which we're getting that data that's due to the Agency of Education.
And I believe the bulk of it is due on the 15th of February. You'll recall that when I came in before, I had this is the not the identical spreadsheet, but all of this is the same underlying methodology that was used to make the graph that we looked at before. But I can't share the FY27 data because it was confidential forecast.
And that data needs to be voted on. So what are the proposed budgets and what are the final budgets? If and when this bill goes into effect, it will be based on the voted budgets for this year.
Exactly. So precisely, right. So assuming that S220, the Senate Finance Amendment Draft 1.1 goes into effect, essentially the FY27 budgets that education spending that we're looking at now would become the FY25 in this spreadsheet. So it's what everything would be compared against.
On that point, my concern with using FY26 as an overlay is that was really warrant starting in the fall of 24 into then voted on in spring of 25. That seems to me, as I recollect, the trailing end of a lot of the federal dollars. So it just seems like we're riding a blip of adjustments in the budgets that I'm very interested to see this overlaid with FY 27 numbers, warrant budgets, which we would have in 3 days.
So that is what I originally presented to the committee last week,
Okay. But not with district by district.
but not with the district by district. Once that budget information comes in, absolutely, that can be updated.
But I think Senator Beck made this point, is that the percentage increase for last year's budget was about the same as the estimated percentage increase in aggregate for this year's budgets. So I think your point is relevant for the year before, when we saw that really big increase, and that's when our budgets went down and everything. But last year's increase was about the same as this year's.
Yeah.
Or the projected for this year overall. In fact, this year's might be lower.
Yeah, I think this is in the ballpark of where it's been historically.
Yeah, and it's obviously going to be different for every school district, but it's.
And to that point, the point of offsetting revenues and federal funds, we have seen. It's a question for the fields, and the agency in terms of how that has impacted their budgeting, moving forward out of COVID. I will say that the data set that has been linked on these big printouts that we're looking at thus far from the school district redistricting task force has a number of tabs in which you can see the offsetting revenues, both for the state and at the district level. So, and when you look at that, you see that significant bubble of offsetting revenues from the federal government has passed. I'm not saying it doesn't have ripple effects, but that the share of federal funds is less significant than it was earlier.
We're building off of that base that came out of that big increase.
I just want to say thank you, Julia. This is really helpful.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay.
So coming back here, so we just talked about the dual test, right? The allowable growth based off of those steps of calculations we just made, comparing it to the prior year ed spend increased by inflation, whichever is greater becomes the cap for that district. So then the next, and this is what we see here in the, if it had existed using the dual test. The final two columns that we're looking at here are, to all of your point, if this had existed in FY20, if this had existed for FY26, looking backwards, what would the change have had to be for districts? So what we're doing here is we're comparing, okay, here is what they would have been capped at. Here is what they actually spent. What is the difference? And so what we see here for Addison Central, they spent below what they would have been capped at. The first example that we get to is Arlington, that would have needed to decrease their spending to fit underneath their cap by 306,908. So this column here is reflecting those dollar amounts if it were to have existed for FY26. And then the final column is the relative percentage, the relative percent decrease. So this is essentially saying, comparative within its district ed spend, what share of that 306,908, how would that have impacted Arlington's overall education spend? Right, 306,908 and a $500 million education spend is not going to have the same impact as a school district with a budget of $1 million, because the way percentages work, which I know you all know. So that's what I put together for those, level growths.
Okay. So depending on where the budgets end up this year, which will ultimately depend on the voters, and some of those aren't being voted in May. But we should have a pretty good idea in March, but they have been back closer to the 4 to 6% that was normal growth before COVID.
Mhm.
So this should not be a real shock.
I can't comment on that. I will say, solely from the technical mechanics perspective, my chair. One of the pieces of this, to your point, is with the FY 27 budgets, we'll have that education spending. We'll be able to do all of this work using the FY 27 education spending once it's been approved. So we'll know the maximum amount of education spending for FY 28 before school districts start building their budgets, because there is this hard cap being created. So as we know, during the current ed finance process, school districts started building their budgets in August, September. And then that budgeting process is ramping up. The December 1 letter comes where we have these forecasts that are so preliminary, they're confidential, which is why I can't share them with the committee. And then those final amounts start coming forward, with a cap that uncertainty would not exist in the same way, because we would know the maximum amount every school district would be permitted to spend up to.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just trying to go through and see some of the outliers, mostly the outliers at the upper end. There are a lot of zeros, which is kind of heartening to see. School districts are doing their hard work. But there are some that I'm not sure what is driving it, like Canaan. Is it just because it's a tiny little school district? But because that's the one that gets hit the hardest, I think, in terms of a percentage amount. But then there's also Ludlow, Mount Holly, which gets hit pretty hard from a percentage amount, and Green Mountains School District. So I'm just trying to see, are those the same kinds of school district, given that we have so many different types of school districts? Like, is there a kind that's trying to find trends?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I will say, looking at Cleveland, I would encourage you to, I kept going back and forth. Should I fit all the columns onto one spreadsheet and make it so tiny I couldn't read it, or break it up? But I would encourage you to look at both spreadsheets together. So for instance, when we're looking at Canaan here, which I've got pulled up on the screen, we see that Canaan had a relative ed spend increase of 22% from FY 25 to FY 26. And they also had a relative decrease in their weighted student count of 6%. Relative change. So putting those together, their per pupil spend increased relatively from 25 to 26 by 29%. That's why.
No, I understand from a math perspective why, but I'm wondering if there's some factor, like, are these operating districts or all tuition districts? Are they, only elementary school? Are they in a particular part of the state? Are they, are there factors like
Small, medium, large.
small, medium, large? Are they the dual state district? How's that interstate district? How's that being impacted? So, I mean, I understand from a math perspective, it's just from an operational perspective. Is this causing a problem for a particular type of district or not? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
It's a great question. It's one that I don't know the answer to. I will say that the AOE does also publish on its website, and I think I sent this link to Charlotte last We,
We'll find it.
the per pupil spend by year. And included in that, they sort all of these school districts into small, medium, and large and operating structure.
Mhm.
So one of the ways to look at the underlying characteristics of these districts would be to crosswalk it with that printout.
Mhm.
But I don't know.
I mean, the general thing I see is that if you lost long-term wage in Indiana,
Yeah.
you're spending about that.
And that could mean you're losing actual students, but it could also mean your weights are changing, like,
Could be either
you know,
both.
or
the other,
both.
Yeah,
and so that's the
Yeah.
thing that is sort of beyond the district's control.
But that's why there's an appeal.
or a second test.
Yeah, the second test does, you can see the second test helping some districts that are losing and,
And if you've lost a family of heavily weighted students moved out,
In a small
then
district.
you've got an appeal process. Senator, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one trend that I see in my Chittenden County district is that, and I brought this up before, but Burlington, Colchester, Winooski, that all have outstanding debt due to school construction, they're all seeing a decrease. 3%, 7%, and 2%. That's one, and again, I would reiterate that that spending is at this point, it's not programmatic and there's not much we can do about debt spending. It's there and it's not going anywhere until we fade it down. But I also noticed that these schools have high percentages and populations of English language learners and students of color. Burlington, Winooski, South Burlington. And I'm just observing that they're all seeing a decrease.
But the spend, if you're doing debt service, that's figured in to the base budget. And if you've got a lot of weighted students, that's figuring in to the base budget. So unless you've got a huge change in those weights, or you have a debt service that's scheduled to increase, usually they go down, but that shouldn't impact your percentage increase, right?
So your percentage increase prior to the caps. Yes, the other piece that perhaps I should have led with in my answer to Senator Hardy's question about identifying trends in those districts that would have needed to be cut. You all know this. Correlation is not causation. And so naturally, higher spending districts are going to likely need to cut more because of the structure of the formula, right? It's not, and when looking at spending changes and weighted and the per weighted pupil spending change, to all of your points, we don't know unless every single school district is interviewed how they created their budgeting process and what went into all of their ed spending decisions. We don't know what drove up ed spend or drove down ed spend, right? We really don't know. So I don't know.
So this is really helpful. Thank you, Julia. I would echo what I said previously, is I'd love to see this with FY27 warrant budgets if that's possible. I just want to also echo what Senator Hardy said the last time this came up, is you don't want to vote in the dark. We need to know what the implication, because there are some major assumptions in this, which is both the maximum pupil amount, which you change that. This is based on THEFR, the highest per pupil spend last year. We don't know what that's gonna settle at this year. We don't even know where that ballpark's gonna be, and the 3 to 9% too, that's somewhat arbitrary, so. I still think this is worth more discussion. I don't know what our time pressures are on this. It seems like crossover is a couple of weeks out, but I'd certainly like to see some numbers of FY 27. Then I'd also love, if this goes forward, to hear from the Secretary of Education or her delegate on the overlay of this and the districts that, if this were overlaid at FY 27, what it means to them, because we do need to know how this impacts those on the ground, what this would translate to if it was overlaid in this context. So I really appreciate it. We need to see some data, and that's what we're seeing now.
Yay, thank you. And to the, if we see next, this year's budgets, after we get the data that you can actually use. This provision won't apply to these budgets. It would be the following year, so it still wouldn't be the actual budgets that are applied to it. Yeah, okay.
Okay,
And to that point, these final columns, we won't be able to calculate these last final columns
Yeah.
because we don't know what districts would have budgeted in FY 28.
Right.
So we can estimate the cap once we know all school district budgets, because it's based against the highest per pupil spend amount, and not all school districts vote until,
it may even be June at this point.
yeah.
Well, when you get the data for this year, or the estimated, the budgets that they're gonna warn, essentially, you can use those budgets versus last year's, but just move this analysis up 1 year.
On the warrant budget numbers.
Yes, and we won't know their FY 28,
Right,
but so like all of this total amount of school districts would have had to increase spending. We don't know, because we don't know what they would have spent if there weren't a cap.
Right. Remember, the purpose of this bill is to try and give some relief to taxpayers until the foundation formula goes in. The foundation formula is forecasted to be less than some of these spends. And I think we heard that there is a platinum healthcare plan, which is fine, but a lot of those taxpayers are struggling to see if they can afford any health insurance this year. And I'm trying to get some testimony on that. But there is another side to this that has a phase 2 that we're not seeing, that somebody is paying that additional amount, and it's hurting. We still can't get tax delinquencies, but there's some scuttlebutt that it is going up, but that was the purpose. So, Julia, I think you got another question for Julia, and then I'm gonna
No,
move this along.
that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, so I appreciate if the committee is out of time. There are maybe 4 more spreadsheets on the communication training, because you said you wanted to see data, but
Go through the spreadsheets. We are not out of time.
so these ones will be quicker because they're not as extensive. So I guess the first piece is I was asked to come back with information about tuition. The challenge is,
This,
yeah, I think
Okay.
so. The challenge is that the allowable tuition is not yet calculated for FY 26, right? So it won't be coming out until December. So we've got, so you have a set of allowable tuition printouts in front of you that are comparing FY 24 to FY 25, because that is the most recent 2 years available. And then we also have the FY 25, FY 26 announced tuition. So let's start with FY 25, FY 26 announced tuition, because those are the more similar years. And I will say right up front, I do not know as much about tuition and the calculations of announced tuition and allowable tuition as I do about some other ed finance topics. So I've compiled this data for you all to review, and I won't be able to speak to it with the same level of nuance. So we're looking at here is announced tuition for fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26. This is that other really big spreadsheet that you have. This information, this data is available on the AOE's website, so you could access it. And really what I did is I took the data, I aggregated it into one spreadsheet by putting the FY25 and FY26 for each grade level together, and then calculated a relative change. So we have them, here you have the grade range, and then what we're looking at here are the different grades with the announced tuition. So the kindergarten part-time, kindergarten full-time. With the
Okay, these are the public schools, right? From the the tuitioning public schools.
and independent and everybody's on here. This is your announced tuition. You'll recall that the announced tuition is different than the calculation of the allowable tuition.
We discussed that, okay.
Yeah, it's only the independent schools that don't accept the announced tuition. So the ones that Brookhaven Academy takes, it just takes the announced tuition, the average announced tuition of the public schools, so they don't show up on there. They just pay whatever that average is.
Okay.
Yeah, so they don't show up on here. But the ones that don't, Burton, St. John's, Academy, Limited Institute, they don't take the average now, so they show up.
Okay. So, and then we've got it for elementary, secondary, and vocational. So that's what we're seeing here on this spreadsheet. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Chair, or get time to ask a question.
No, we can ask questions. I want to get to Jake, and I thought I'd give you a 10-minute break, but.
So this is a naive question. I'm gonna reveal my naivete, but for the sending districts, the districts that tuition. Okay, so I would like to know, how do they choose that budget amount? So do they calculate how many kids they need to send or how much they're gonna need to tuition? And then the amount is what the announced tuition is in the independent schools, and then they ask the voters to approve that amount? What does that process look like?
So it's actually pretty simple. The sending district, they say that they have 100 kids that go to Linden Institute, and then say they have 25 kids that go to Blue Mountain Union. In this, well, no later than January 15th, both Linden Institute and Blue Mountain Union have to announce what tuition they're going to charge for the next year. They multiply the Linden tuition by 100, they multiply the Blue Mountain Union tuition by 25, and they budget for that.
And that's what goes on the ballot. And then the same calculation, no?
No, they, that's a budget expense. And then from there, they, add up all their other budget expenses. They subtract, all their offsetting revenues. They determine an education spending amount. And that's what the voters approve the budget spending. The education spending is just for tax purposes.
So the cap still applies to what they would approve to the voters, independent of what that announced allowable tuition was. So they increase it so much, but there's still a growth cap. That growth cap would still prevent them from being able to pay those tuitions. Is that correct? If there was a major tuition increase?
If the tuition increases were greater than what their allowable increases, then it would put pressure on the rest of their budget. I think that's what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
Yes, which is why we had you know,
Yep.
do we want to have a parallel system to control those tuition increases? Yeah.
That helps. That's what I thought I understood, but then I'm not seeing a reason to cap the tuition if we're really capping the spending, which effectively caps the amount, but it does put pressure on their other elementary.
Pressure on the, yes.
Yeah, and this, the spending caps that we just discussed are only on public schools, so the private school tuition isn't capped unless we put a cap
We
on.
added. to the
Yeah,
bill.
I thought we were adding a 6% cap. Why 6%? I thought it was being added.
The last,
That may be the,
3% or different.
Well-
yeah,
the last time we looked at 220, there was, I don't know who, but was it, yeah, I think it was Senator Bulick.
Yeah.
That there was a calculation to determine what the maximum tuition increase for a receiving school. It's important to understand that a receiving school is,
Changed it.
oh, I don't, well,
Yeah.
but it's just important to understand that a receiving school is, well, let me put it to you this way. For just, there's about 5 schools that set their, independent schools that set their own tuition, kind of put them off on the side. Okay, and then there are, I don't know, 13 remaining schools. They take the average announced tuition. So whatever when the public schools, when they set their tuition, there's an average, okay? That's what those 13 schools take, okay? The public schools, they can set their tuition, current law, they can set their tuition at whatever they want. As can those 5 independent schools. Okay, so what we're talking about here, I think, is how do we do we put restraint on how much on the increase that all of those public schools and those 5 independent schools can increase.
We have to look at what the language is, because I thought
Yeah.
we made a distinction between independent schools and public schools that receive. Yeah, we did.
Yeah, they really are the same. I mean, if like, for example, the items, they send all their kids, out to public schools in Chittenden County. If those public schools in Chittenden County all increase their announced tuition by 20%, I'll say they would, but if they did,
No.
Grand Island is gonna get killed, right? Yeah. So,
okay.
Break time?
And, now we're gonna do Jake. If we're finished with questions for Julia. Thank you. That was a lot of data.
Yeah.
thank you, Julia.
Thanks, Julia.
Okay, Jake, then I'm gonna give it with. Right.
Okay. I have no spreadsheets for you at all. Jake Feldman, tax
That's probably
department.
good. We're spreadsheeted out.
Now, Julia is a hero. That was the main thing.
Yeah, that is awesome. Thank you. So helpful.
So, Jake Feldman, tax department. And, let's see, I have a handout, very short, handout under my name on the
Yep.
committee page. That's it, Chip? Yeah, that'd be wrong. Really?
After this, it's down.
Yeah. So Julia covered the how, of this, and, I think my goal is to cover the why
Okay.
of it. So I was asked by my commissioner to try to think a little bit more long-term. People are very focused on FY 27 and what the buy down or what the one-time money buy down, whatever you call it, needs to be. And he was asking me, well, what are the future years gonna look like? And how do we bend the curve and get on a more sustainable track? Which we all hope, or many of us hope would be the foundation formula. So I did take a look at it. This is very high level, and there's details in here that I, are not perfect, but directionally it is correct. So it looks like that property taxes will continue to increase by about 7% per year. And the reason that's the case is because education fund costs in this decade have been going up by about 6% per year, total education fund uses. And then the non-property sources to the ed fund, like sales tax and part of meals and rooms, part of purchase and use, are forecast by the economists to go up by about 3% per year. So you put those things together, and it looks like property taxes would naturally want to rise about 7% per year. And so that that makes it compelling to put policies in place like S220, because if they weren't in place, it looks like an increasing amount of one-time money would need to be applied to the ed fund from somewhere, presumably the general fund, to try to keep property taxes going up around 5% a year or so.
I've been told they don't have it across the hall. I've been told.
I've heard that.
Yes, they don't have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you're assuming in that calculation that the inflation rate would stay what it is today and that there would be no changing in healthcare spending and no houses built. And so if you're sort of like assuming that it's a static or current day scenario as you're making those projections of 7% per year.
Yeah, pretty much. So if there's new grand list, like new houses built, so that would be helpful. You're right. But what I'm looking at is total property taxes, like how much does the state collect?
Mhm.
So yes, there would be a new base, which is good, but the amount the state needs to collect would be the same. As far as inflation goes, I didn't have a number to plug in about a different direction. So it's what it really does is it just kind of looks at what has been happening since 2020 and then projects it forward. I think Julia's going to prepare something for Ways and Means that is like this, but much better next week. But it'll be similar story.
Really, any questions for Jake?
The alligator mouth, right?
Alligator, classic alligator.
All the alligator mouth.
Yeah, we are back to the alligator. Okay, committee, I'm gonna be really merciful and give you a 15-minute break and then